just tweeting to tell people to watch this online. So.
When I was planning to stay for this event, I was quite busy. See myself in the gym. It's a bit of
So I'm just tweeting to tell people to watch.
Thank you. Okay. I think we missed that, but you can still let them know that we will put the link on the conference website.
Okay. Good morning. Welcome, everyone, or welcome back, those of you live, and welcome to those of you online. This is the closing panel of the South African Reserve Bank's Biennial Conference for 2019 on managing external vulnerabilities, implications for emerging market economies. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I am very proud and honored to be allowed to chair this panel as the civilian among four real policymakers. We are grateful to the South African Reserve Bank, which has brought together an extremely rich and in-depth discussion by assembling academics and policymakers from around the world, as well as, of course, people from within the South African economics and business community, the banking community, even, dare I say, the real estate community. This conference has covered a number of topics, but all with the practical mindset of what is it that central banks can take from the recent academic research, from close self-examination, from comparison and benchmarking with each other in such areas as communication, practice of inflation targeting, macroprudential policy. These are all day-to-day needs for central banks and their decision makers to keep processing and keep on top of. And I want to commend Governor Lesetja Kganyago and the South African Reserve Bank for convening here in Africa such an outstanding group as a public good to the policymakers in this region. The conference will close with this public panel. For those of you who wish to watch online, or those of you who can tweet or post online to encourage others, the link will be coming up here. There's a link on the conference website at the SARB website. It'll also be available on YouTube and Facebook via the South African Reserve Bank. And we at Peterson may try to promote it as well when they wake up in the US. Let me just briefly introduce the four distinguished policymakers we have for today's discussion. Of course, on my right is our host and leader, Governor Lesetja Kganyago. He is, of course, as well the chair of the IMFC and a leader both internationally and within South Africa for sensible, open discussion of, God willing, sensible, good policies. Next to him is Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Sheila Mbijue. Please forgive my pronunciation. She was appointed Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya starting in June 2015. She's the first woman in Kenya to be appointed as an Executive Director of a publicly quoted commercial bank. She's previously worked in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank, the Financial Reporting Center of Kenya, and in Price Waterhouse Kenya and Deloitte Touche Kenya. In other words, she is someone who knows what's actually in the books and knows in a real way what financial transmission and monetary transmission are about. And she is a founding member of the Monetary Policy Committee in Kenya, as well as the Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act Advisory Committee of Kenya. So I think we can all benefit from her insights. On her right is Dr. Tobias Adrian, who is Financial Counselor and Director of the Monetary and Capital Markets Department of the International Monetary Fund. Tobias, as was mentioned in our previous session with his colleagues, has been a true leader in the field of making sense of the various empirical work that can be done to determine what actually works in the field of macroprudential policy, as well as the continuous updating of the monetary policy frameworks around the world. He came to his role as head of MCM and financial counselor at the IMF from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where he was a senior vice president and associate director of research, but he also contributed globally to discussions of this issue for some time and has a distinguished academic record. Finally, sitting at my far right is Luis Awazu Pereira da Silva. Again, forgive my pronunciation, Luis. He is Deputy General Manager of the Bank for International Settlements. It's since 2015, time flies. Before joining the BIS, Luis, a Brazilian national, had been Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Brazil, and as we discussed yesterday as well, Luis and his colleagues at the Central Bank of Brazil, played a fascinating role in trying to maintain stability in that country and economy, but also setting some models for dealing with exchange rate flows and inflation in emerging markets. He is an international official, having represented the World Bank and worked for the World Bank in Washington, Tokyo, and Southern Africa, and previously as Brazil's Deputy Finance Minister in charge of international affairs. So there is only one ground rule which I will set for this, which the governor has blessed my doing, which is even with these distinguished people, they will be limited to 3-minute replies on any given topic. This is to make sure the lightning round, we get the benefit of all their views. About half to 2/3 of the way through the discussion, we will open it up for questions from the distinguished audience, and as well as comments if you dare. I'm going to sit back down now, but I will try to be an active moderator, and my colleagues, I think, will remain seated as well. We'll hope to see over these very tall screens. Thank you, Lucetia. As a first question, let me open it up to Governor Kganyago. You have been noted for your prominence in the overall economic policy debate in South Africa. To what extent do you feel, or in what ways do you feel that central banks in emerging markets have to speak out on issues that are not narrowly in their remit? Are there any trade-offs in doing so? Are there any requirements on the central bank to make that effective?
Central banks have been successful in what they are supposed to do. And because central banks have been successful in what they are supposed to do, which is to maintain price stability, society is expecting of central banks to do a lot of other things which might not be in the remit of the central banks to do. Part of it is that central banks themselves drew these things on themselves, that in the aftermath of the global crisis, words like, phrases like the central banks are the only game in town, meant that society then expect, if you are the only game in town, then we expect you to be delivering on certain things. But then the broadening of the responsibility of central banks is not without risks. Sure, price stability was not the be-all and end-all, and as it turns out that in the run-up to the global financial crisis, there were financial risks building up in the systems, and many central banks missed them. Fortunately, in South Africa, we didn't miss that. Our supervisors were on top of that. So financial stability mandates got added, and that becomes tricky because some of the things you do with financial stability could actually have significant distributional effects. And when you have those distributional effects, the question comes as to whether that should be in the hands of central banks, or should it be in some other authority. We have chosen to stay in our lane. We have got an explicit financial stability mandate. Our price stability mandate says that what we do is in the interest of balance and sustainable growth. And quite frankly, when you look at the mandates of many other central banks, they will have something along those lines, whether it's promoting welfare or promoting rising standards of living and so forth. So those things are there in the a broader discourse with respect to policy, but it just reflects the fact that price stability is a means to an end. And just as I conclude to say that when there were questions about the role of the Reserve Bank in South Africa, it was not because of what we were doing in monetary policy. It was because we were called upon to interfere with what banks were doing, which was to enforce the laws of this country, and we were expected that we should step in a relationship between the banks and some other prominent family. And when we said that we could not do this, we were faced with this barrage of attack. I never knew that Twitter could be weaponized, but we were the subject of attacks on social media as a result of that. So let me leave it there, and I can tell you I don't think that my Kenyan colleagues had it any easier.
Precisely. So let me turn to our Kenyan colleague. You work in an economy that is considered by many to be a frontier economy rather than a so-called emerging market. Does that change the role of the central bank, and how do you think about issues of structural reforms as well as the narrower remit of the central bank?
Firstly, I'd like to thank the SARB. I think this conference is very important, and when we talk about public good for Africa, I agree with you. And in fact, I'm always delighted to come down here because I think we have a different perspective, and I'm always happy that the SARB is willing and interested to listen to our perspective. So I'd like to thank the audience, I'd like to thank the academics, international and domestic speakers for the contributions and what we've been able to gain today and yesterday. I think when I look at the mandates of central banks, and particularly the Central Bank of Kenya, the first thing that comes to mind is that the bank was created 50 years ago, approximately. And so when you look at it, you see that it's evolved over time, but those evolutions happen slowly. Maybe they're reviewed every 10 years or something like that. And obviously the world is changing dramatically. The other thing that you need to take into consideration is the capacity of any country in the mandate that it gives its central bank. So I remember going to the Riksbank in Sweden, and all they do is monetary policy. And of course, African central banks, we cover so many things. And in fact, as the world becomes more complicated and as the financial sectors become deeper and more complicated, there's a tendency to give that problem to the central bank. And that's why I was very interested in yesterday's debate on this integrated approach, because we can see that we can't move away from this. This thing is going to continue to come. And at the same time, we have to manage our independence. I think I prefer to think of the independence more as only confined to monetary policy. We still have a role of responsibility and responsiveness to the people who put us into office. So I think from a Kenyan perspective, we're in the stages of reviewing. We're at the stage of re-looking at how our central bank should be into the future. And we hope to incorporate some of the issues that were raised today. But also, just in closing, I want to also distinguish. When we've been talking about South Africa, we've been talking about emerging markets, and a lot of the speakers came from developed markets. And of course, I don't know, we have all kinds of funny ways of describing ourselves. I don't know if I'm a lower middle income country or a frontier market or whatever the distinction is, but it does make us different, and it does make the challenges we have different, and also the opportunities that we have different. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning to both, first Tobias and then Louise, without going into much detail or in any way implicating you, both of you gave presentations in the conference yesterday talking about issues of integrating inflation targeting with macroprudential or financial stability issues, with exchange rate issues. And you also both, particularly I think you, Tobias, but also Luis from life experience, we're talking about the relevance of sort of the general inflation targeting paradigm to emerging markets of whatever name or stripe. Could you say a bit about how you see these things fitting together?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on this panel, and thanks so much for running this fantastic conference. Let me start by resonating with some of the things that were said, which is when we look around the world at institutional setups, we really see that central bank independence is one of the governance principles that is very, very important in order to have a stable monetary system. And it's also at the root, depending on how the financial stability framework is organized. But central bank independence typically also plays a very important role within the prudential framework of each country. Of course, there are many institutions that contribute to financial stability. It's not only the central bank. But the central bank independence is one of the pillars of both monetary and financial stability. And we see that again and again when we look across countries in the world. So in terms of thinking about monetary stability and financial stability, let me just say that we continue to view price stability as the primary mandate for monetary policy. And it is very, very important that the central bank focuses on price stability as a primary mandate and has a credible and framework around that price stability mandate. But of course, monetary stability and financial stability are intertwined. So the first order tools for financial stability are prudential tools. So those are both microprudential and macroprudential tools. And as Governor Cagagno pointed out, there's a long tradition of good supervision in South Africa. So I think what we've seen around the world over the past 10 years is that stress testing has become a lot more important in the prudential approach, and so we have sort of like a new way of gauging whether capital and liquidity are adequate in the banking system and in the financial system overall. So prudential tools remain the first order approach to ensure financial stability, but of course there are interlinkages in between monetary and financial stability. And so at the IMF we are thinking more and more about integrated approaches to model both monetary and financial stability within a common framework. And this is really what Adam alluded to, which is to think about both business cycle fluctuations as well as the financial cycle, and to think about monetary stability and financial stability within one sort of like macro financial approach is certainly a goal that we are working on. But that shouldn't distract from the primary importance of monetary policy for price stability.
Thank you, Tobias. Luis.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for Governor Cagagno for the invitation to this excellent conference. Similarly to what Tobias was saying, I think EMEs realize that they have institutions that should be conducting their respective mandates of keeping, particularly central banks, price and financial stability. But I think they also realized that given the magnitude of international interactions, capital flows, for example, the spillovers effects of this into their domestic mandates and institutions were perhaps sometimes excessive, and that therefore the motto with which many emerging markets have lived, which was precisely to maintain price and financial stability under these conditions by keeping your house in order, was not necessarily was sufficient and important and should continue, but required additional tools. And that's why many EMEs, including Brazil, for example, in my past incarnation, began resorting to thinking of integrating into their flexible inflation targeting framework FX interventions and macroprudential tools. Not to derail from a floating exchange rate regime, but to try to use these additional tools as elements that would sort of help the central bank to fulfill its monetary price stability mandate and financial stability mandate. And to a great extent, these additional tools have proven very effective. They have shown results in many of our countries, but I think they require also an additional level of reflection. Because these spillovers are international, I think it also requires some reflection at the international community level to think of countries that are issuing large capital flows and countries that are in the receiving end of large capital flows on how to best manage, let's say, this much needed international flows of savings across the world, which has many beneficial effects. But when in periods of exceptional circumstances, such as very low interest rates in one part of the world vis-a-vis higher interest rates in other parts, need to be sort of coordinated in a better way so that these spillovers are, let's say, less can be beneficial, but they're sort of negative effects in terms of threatening financial stability in receiving countries with this, despite the use of macro-proofs and FX interventions, can be mitigated.
Thank you, Luis. The issue of international spillovers is critical, and I'm going to come back to that if I may. But first, could you just, Luis, just quickly or briefly rattle off when you say these tools, could you specify a bit about what set of tools you have in mind? What do you think worked?
The tools that have been used are essentially of two sorts in terms of financial stability for financial stability purposes. FX interventions not to define any specific level for the exchange rate, but to smooth fluctuations, excessive fluctuations that have implications for the firms and banks, financial institutions, and the financial stability in the receiving country. It's as if you were sort of, to some extent, trying to sort of offer some hedge to the private sector that have conducted excessive indebtedness in some episodes, and that, of course, these imbalances need to be corrected, but if they are corrected in just one shot because of an abrupt movement in the exchange rate, might entail a risk for financial stability. So in order to respect the mandate of financial stability of the central bank, then you sort of offer some form of periodic hedge to the local indebted firms and banks. And the other is, of course, macro-proofs, because we know that countercyclical macro-proofs and macroprudential tools can mitigate the excessive transmission of these flows into your domestic credit cycle, can help also to ensure the resilience and the health of your local financial system.
Thank you. Again, before turning to the international spillovers issue, from the point of view of your central bank, Sheila Lasecha, how do you view the management of the exchange rate today? I mean, what sort of approach do you think is necessary?
I think I'm being reminded that I'm a frontier state again. I think from our perspective, we take the position that we have a free and floating exchange rate, and that we will intervene if we see speculation or unwarranted volatility. So that has been the approach. And I've been asked many questions on this, and some of these things I think are interesting. For example, in 2017, we had a difficult year in Kenya. We had a drought, and we had 2 elections. And, you know, I always ask people to look at the reserves at that time. And yet the stability of the exchange rate was there. It wasn't totally stable, but it was there in the period. So I think we have to actually monitor it over time and just see what the impact is and what creates that impact. Kenya has a fairly balanced inflows and outflows of Forex. We're a fairly small economy. I think our remittances, for example, grew 40% in 2016, which just shows the impact that these types of inflows are having on stabilizing our exchange. So I think it's something that's has been a big discussion and will continue to be a big discussion. And I think from yesterday's discussions, what I've taken away is that there's more than one way to manage the Forex market.
I'm not a great believer in intervention, and this is why. The history of foreign exchange intervention in South Africa has not been a great one. And I want to tell you that in 1998, we intervened in the foreign exchange market. We spent some $26 billion, and we had nothing to show for it. And after $26 billion later, the currency still ran away from us. In 2001, we experienced a currency attack, and the attitude of the authorities was that we are not getting into this market. Let buyers and sellers sort themselves out in the market. Surprise, surprise, the currency recovered within 3 weeks time. South Africans have got very short memories. So when the currency depreciated in 2001, they called for a commission of inquiry into the rapid depreciation of the currency. And then by 2006, 2007, the currency was appreciating. Nobody called for a commission of inquiry into the rapid appreciation of the currency. So that tells you that when South Africans talk about interventions, they are symmetric. But during that period, the central bank accumulated significant reserves, paid off the oversold forward position, and built reserves. And at that time, there was a screaming from the export sector that said, do something about the exchange rate. We bought as much reserves as we could until we ran out of the resources to buy the reserves. Now, the underlying philosophy for us is that, well, we will only come into the market when there are serious market dislocation. But truth of the matter is that the South African foreign exchange market is so deep and broad, it functions so well, but can we take account of the following? When the South African authorities think of intervening, be cognizant that 70% of rand foreign exchange trading takes place outside the country. So we are going to have to intervene 24 hours, not just during South African hours. And we probably would need to have people in those centers so that we could do the interventions unless we discover some robots that will intervene on our behalf. In which case then we would be talking of something else. Just so you conclude, like many instruments, the efficacy thereof has not quite been tested. And I am not convinced, by the way, that intervening will necessarily end the volatility. Actually, it might just exacerbate the volatility. And this is why I think it could exacerbate the volatility. When the central bank then starts to intervene, the markets then have to ask themselves, at what stage are they going to stop, or are they going to be in this market forever? That in itself could propel a volatility. That said, I mean, I guess every now and then, in every generation, a younger group of central bankers come and they think that it might be a cool thing to intervene, and that maybe where their predecessors didn't succeed, they could succeed. And I remain to be convinced about the efficacy of intervention. As I said, if there is market dislocation, there might be a case to come in. But if you end up with a situation where there is dislocation and the markets are not quite functioning, you've got to ask yourself, what is the source of the dysfunctional? Because if the dysfunctionality is purely as a result of an imbalance between demand and supply, then one thing must adjust, and that is price. And so central bankers need some humility. And the humility central bankers need is that of the many things that we are able to control, the exchange rate is not one of them.
Yeah, let me just add to that a little bit. So when we look across countries, we do see that there's, of course, a lot of heterogeneity in terms of how liquid foreign exchange markets are. And in the case of South Africa, there's a lot of liquidity in the FX market. And so in general, we think that FX interventions are probably more effective in markets where liquidity is relatively lower. So I think I would support the governor's views here. And then in terms of the spillovers of capital flows into the domestic economy, so one of the motivations that policymakers around the world are making in order to justify FX interventions is that easy global financial conditions can spill over into domestic financial conditions and lead to build-up of vulnerabilities domestically. And of course, the first-order tools to address those build-ups of vulnerabilities would be prudential tools, i.e. capital, liquidity in the banking sector, in the non-banking sector, as well as demand-side tools such as underwriting standards in the housing market or the corporate market. So in principle, when prudential tools are very well developed, in principle, that would take care of one of the motivations for these FX interventions. Now, having said that, when we look across countries, we don't find that FX interventions are systematically undermining inflation targeting objectives. So we don't find that countries that are intervening in FX markets are any better or less good at targeting inflation. But I do want to reiterate the point that I made earlier that price stability remains the primary target for monetary policy.
Luis raised that was great to be so responsive, but Luis raised a broader sense of the spillovers. I mean, that it's not just about exchange rate management, and I know none of you said that. I guess, and my own attempted contribution to this conference yesterday was to talk about some ways in which changes in the U.S. in particular, but also in technology, may be changing the international dynamics. Lisetta, you're just back from chairing the sessions at the IMF annual meetings. What do you view as the state of play on terms of at the policy discussion level among the leadership? What can be done about international spillovers? Is there an agreement, at least even if nothing can be done on the issue, or is there very strong disagreement on how people see this?
Yeah, just as I come, I just wanted to on the previous conversation, just to say that between 2002 and 2009, the South African Reserve Bank bought $76 billion worth of reserves. $76 billion. We moved from negative reserves of 26 billion to positive reserves of just over $50 billion. We had done that thing. So foreign exchange intervention is there as an instrument. And all that I was asking is, we have got to test the efficacy of this instrument and have an honest conversation with society. Because soon as we talk about intervening, society's expectation is that we would be able to control the exchange rate. And if central banks do not communicate this honestly to say that we do not control the exchange rate, then we are going to lose the plot. We know in this country, when the currency depreciates, people say, the constitution says you must protect the currency. You have not protected it because it has depreciated against the dollar. So that's the one thing. But the exchange rate is also an important channel for those international spillovers that you talked about. So when the advanced economies embarked on quantitative easing in 2010, 2011, Luis's former minister coined a term that said that there is a currency war taking place. These guys have come with these instruments. They are appreciating our currency. They are bad. And we had to start to think of coming with other instruments to try and stop the flows from coming through. And at that time, I think that there wasn't an appreciation of the impact of these spillovers. Since then, the IMF had to compile an annual report or maybe twice a year report to the G20 that tries to evaluate the impact of the spillovers from the policy settings in the advanced economies to the policy settings in the emerging markets. These things are complex. I didn't have any sense, even in that report, I don't think that there is any attempt by the G20 to try and coordinate. So we have got a global economy without a global government, and so it doesn't look like there is coordinated policy responses. But in terms of the global economy itself, I mean, we have categorized the interventions to be in the form of countries with fiscal space must use it, and those which do not have the fiscal space must start a process of consolidation, fiscal consolidation, and do that in a growth-friendly manner. Monetary policy, many countries have run out of monetary policy space. Fortunately, is not the space that we are in, but the advanced economies, the space is not there, and which then left the only other thing in the trilogy, which was structural reforms. And one of the things that baffled me during these meetings is you have in the room some of the most powerful politicians in the world who run major economies, who say that these structural reforms are politically too difficult, and so they do not get done. And now, these are people who are paid to make political decisions, saying that we can't make these decisions because they are politically difficult. So when you look at the G20 report on the structural reforms, you will actually find that very little progress had been made with respect to structural reform, with the exception of a few countries. And may I say that South Africa only gotten around to start now finally talking about structural reforms. But for the past 10 years, you could say zilch was done with respect to structural reforms. And that just means that responding to these spillovers becomes a challenge if you do not deal with the fundamental issues in your economy.
Luis, and then
I think we all agree with Governor Kanyagwa about the merits of the flexible inflation targeting regime that EMEs have adopted, and the way in which they have to be characterized as being supported by a flexible exchange rate regime. The issue is when the disruptive excessive flows of capital interact with the volatility of your regime and with the credit cycle locally, creating threats to financial instability. That's where it's a very delicate balance, and I fully agree that the communication of this has to be very skillful and very delicate, but policymakers can have a mitigating role in this transmission of international exuberance when it is not warranted for their domestic cycle. Now, there is one thing that I think is a positive progress, and the communication between international authorities and central banks, I think, has improved. I think there is a realization through forward guidance, for example, to the announcement of the way in which changes will occur in monetary policy stances in advanced economies. This has helped to some extent emerging markets to prepare themselves for possible shifts in monetary policy stances, and for these shifts to have effects that are not so damaging in their local financial stability. So although there's much more progress that might be required in terms of the way in which you can communicate the benefits of international cooperation, for example, that showing with cooperation the social global welfare is improved vis-à-vis a situation of attrition and of individual decisions, I think there are, at least in this realm of communication, an improvement that has been achieved.
Yeah, the international monetary system in which we are living in is basically one where central banks in each country have their domestic mandates, and there's quite a bit of communication going on among central banks where they talk to each other and they share what is going on in their respective countries, so that governors from various countries can understand what is going on in different regions in the world. And of course, there is a very, very strong global component to financial conditions. So you can measure financial conditions in many different ways, but it's certainly, we have shown in many different studies that the global financial cycle, which is of course dominated by the financial cycle of the major economies, that has tremendous spillover effects onto domestic financial conditions around the world, including in emerging markets, and but also advanced economies around the world. And then the question is, how should policymakers deal with that? And I think these financial conditions have an important impact on domestic activity, so they have an important impact on inflation dynamics, and so in a flexible inflation targeting framework, you have to condition on the impact of global financial conditions on domestic financial conditions, because to achieve well-anchored inflation expectations in the medium term, this is one very, very important input. Now, financial conditions also have an extremely important effect on the buildup of financial vulnerabilities, and so this is where prudential tools are the first order of defense. So when you look at the world today, interest rates have been declining over many, many years, and this year the decline in interest rates globally has been particularly strong. So what we're seeing around the world is that there's reaching for yield, because investors have difficulty to achieve their nominal return targets. And so there's more and more risk-taking, there's more and more leverage that is building up, and this is both corporate leverage, household leverage, as well as sovereign leverage that is building up around the world. And so then as a policymaker, you have to ask, what do you do in order to make sure that your country is not going to be hit adversely if global financial conditions are reverting? And this is, I think, where prudential policy is particularly important. Now, oh, sorry, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, so just one little sentence in minus 1 second. So some countries are also using the exchange rates and are leaning against inflows when global financial conditions are easy, and then they're leaning against outflows when global financial conditions are getting tight, as a complementary tool to those two tools. And there's some evidence that can mitigate exchange rate volatility to some extent.
I think the spillover also needs to talk to the size of the economy and the connectivity to the developed economies, and obviously the impact that it therefore has. And when we look back at 2007, 2008, and what happened then to the East African economies, for which I can speak to, we see it took a while for those economies to feel the impact of what had happened in the West during that period. So I think that a lot of talk about these matters is at a higher level and doesn't actually look at the individuality of our economies and what actually impacts them. I think one of the things that I'm always telling people is that, Kenya is not a mineral or oil-based economy, and we're very highly diversified. 40+% of our exports are within the region. So when you talk about the spillover effects and what will happen, it takes time, but it does come eventually. The other thing that I wanted just to touch upon, and it's something that the governor raised very clearly, is I was thoroughly amused with the intervention that was done by the Fed in its size, not amused by the intervention, but in its size, in the US with the repo markets. I think in one day it went in with $40+ billion. And when I think that the reserves of Kenya are about $8.5 billion, it really states what defense we have.
Just a reminder on this, and we have some current and former Fed officials in the audience. I think some of them are constrained on speech at the timing, but just 2 reminders. First, a lot of the Fed people would suggest that stuff, those are self-liquidating overnight, and so it's a little different. But the other thing is, I think you're absolutely right to emphasize the scale. And just as a reminder to people that currently the exchange rate war chest of the U.S. government is the same as South Africa's. It's $50 billion. So whenever the U.S. talks tough about intervening, they would have to get an allocation from Congress. They could double it if they get the Fed to go along, but that's not 100% certain. So just for information.
Well, that is also another thing to take into account. They intervene in their own currency, and that makes us different. But that intervention, let's also get, it had nothing to do with the exchange rate. It had to do with domestic liquidity conditions.
Let me turn, before turning to the audience, one final topic, and I appreciate the distinguished panel members for being willing to engage. I'd rather not be talking. The one topic that we went through in I think, very practical detail as well as research basis was issues of communication during the conference. And starting with Sheila, in the same spirit of what you were saying about the individual situation of countries, you're a founding member of your Monetary Policy Committee. What did you have in mind in Kenya as the necessary communication in terms of which audiences, what information you wanted to get across, and have you felt the need to change that over time?
I think on communication, it was actually, when we started monetary policy, we had it as one of our founding pillars. And we worked a lot with the Riksbank in Sweden because they were actually leading in the communication in central banks at that time. We found it difficult. I think central bankers as a whole are not very good communicators. And we set up a structure which subsequently was not as impactful as we wanted it to be. We did, however, adopt a survey, a monetary policy survey, which we do in advance of our monetary policy meetings, which we have found to have really gained traction over time and informed people about what we're doing, and also to get information from the market that we need for the monetary policy decisions. So I think that has helped a lot. And recently we also employed a very prominent ex-journalist as the leader of our communication department at the Central Bank of Kenya. So we're trying now to set up a different structure from the one we originally thought would work for us. And this seems to have got traction. I know one of the things that Kenya did this year that we're very proud of is we did a fintech festival. And it attracted over 2,000 people. And I think of those, about 700 were international guests. So what we're saying is, in doing things like that, we can project ourselves and allow people to understand who we are. Who do we want to address? We want to address the ordinary Kenyan. It will take time because we're not that good at communicating and the subject matter is quite complex. But we're on a journey and we intend to pursue it.
I find that very inspirational. Now, Lusetja, you're obviously the exception to the rule about central bankers being bad communicators, but at least in this building. But so beyond your own personal communication, in the similar kinds of questions to what Sheila was addressing, since you've been governor, how have you wanted the communications to change here at the SARB?
I wish I could do it as well as the Jamaicans do it, because now they are the new standard in central bank communication. I must say that I had found the literature on central bank communication not particularly useful. And I decided to take a different angle because the literature seems to have been so much focused on the impact of central bank communications on markets. It's very focused on the way in which the markets respond. And we found ourselves in South Africa not so much having to communicate about our policy decisions. So we had to layer our communication. We found ourselves having to explain to South Africans what is the South African Reserve Bank and what is its role in economic policy. That's a different set of communication. We had also found ourselves in having to explain why we must be left to act independently and not be muddled with a lot of other things. That is also called for a different approach to communication. I use a lot of animal metaphors when in my communication. I'm able to come down to that level. Something is a challenge that was posed by former President Mbeki, who said, after you have said what you have just said, think of this. Would your grandmother understand what you have just said? And if your grandmother does not understand what you have just said, take it that no journalist understood what you have said. And you have had to come down to that level and have to communicate in that manner. We are having to layer our communication, and we have got a series of what we called monetary policy forums. And over time, we had found that we have been communicating to people who talk and think like us. And we have decided over the past 2 years to get out of the ivory tower and communicate differently. We piloted this with one of our biggest townships in Gauteng called Soweto. And we found that people wanted to talk about so many other things about central banking other than monetary policy, and that had proved useful. And so we have restyled our monetary policy forums now as talk to the SARB forums. So we allow people to talk about anything about the central bank. The danger is that because the central bank is now out there and communicating with the ordinary folks, then the ordinary folks then have problems with government procurement or with business licensing and so forth, and they start asking the Reserve Bank, how could you help us in that respect? And we are having to navigate these things. And lastly, we have decided to take an approach in our communication that said that we would like to embed the South African Reserve Bank in South African society. And one of the big beneficiaries, let me rephrase this thing. One of the spillovers from the state capture era in South Africa was that the Reserve Bank was seen as this pillar of strength. And so when we came under attack, it was seen as they want to get their hands onto the vaults of the Reserve Bank. So that helped, because then we had to embed ourselves in society. But now taking society along with us means that we have got to be out there. We have got to win our arguments in the court of public opinion. And that drags you into a space that becomes very delicate, because there is one group of professionals who believes that the court of public opinion belongs to them. Every 5 years, they go back to the voters and ask for a refreshment of their mandates, and they think once you start playing in that space, that you are playing in their space. So having to strike the balances becomes a very delicate issue and becomes crucial.
Thank you. Luis, now at the BIS, you're at an institution that has almost no public profile, and part of its reason for existence is to convene meetings of people who think and talk like us, so to speak. I'm not attacking the BIS by any means. I'm just noting that you have a different set of demands on your institution than people in a national central bank do. But from your perspective, sitting in Basel, what do you think the international organizations like BIS, like IMF, what should they be doing on the communications front with respect to these issues?
I think we all realize, either at the national or international level, that the art of policy making has become more complicated, including in its communication dimensions for some reasons that Governor Kanyago has laid out, and also because we do live in society that are more diverse, perhaps more divided. We are sort of looking at instances where the effects of globalization have sort of produced winners and losers, where the way in which you have to communicate benefits becomes more complex. So from, I guess, a personal view, an international perspective, the communication of international institutions have to be around the benefits of multilateral cooperation. I think they have to do about the way in which the action of international institutions can help precisely the reduction of negative spillovers and negative spillbacks from crises that are localized into the global economy, showing that through a variety of instruments, whether it is studies, whether it is precisely dialogues, whether it is committee works, that working together and having common standards, having discussions about minimum standards on macroprudential rules, minimum standards on regulations, can help precisely to ensure a safer world where the action of international institutions can be beneficial, and when all actors, whether they are market participants or societies at large, can benefit from this dialogue and cooperation. It is something that is, I think, evolving. If you look at the topics that some international institutions are taking over, although they are very ambitious, take, for example, financial stability worldwide. This is something that has been, where progress has been made in a significant way through, for example, the Basel process, the strengthening of the resilience of financial sector. Think of other things that are even more ambitious, where there is now new voices calling for international cooperations, areas such as climate change, for example, and the interaction between climate change effects and financial stability, which is something that increasingly some central banks are trying to organize a dialogue around the network for greening the financial system. So there are many areas where I think the paramount idea is that what technically is called a cooperative equilibrium is better than what is called a national equilibrium, where everybody does whatever is its own sort of feeling, but at the end of the day, the global welfare might suffer.
I have no idea what that bell is. Tobias, I'm sure you're going to speak on the international role, but if you could, the governor, in his response to this topic, mentioned that he felt the research on central bank communications had not been that helpful to him. In your sort of role as the gatherer of current information, could you say a couple words about where you think the research has been useful?
Yeah, let me first start by saying that what central banks do matters for every citizen, and so in the communication it's important to reach out to every citizen and to explain what it is and how it matters in the everyday life. For organizations such as the BIS or IMF, it's a little bit more difficult because we primarily advise the central banks and the ministries of finance. We don't directly interact with the general public, but we have made a lot of effort at the IMF to really reach out to people around the world and to make the fund a more personal institution. So in terms of research, you know, there is a direct impact of the kind of work that is going on in research departments on policy making. And as the governor points out, sometimes that is helpful, sometimes it's less helpful. But I think over, say, a 10 or 20-year period, you do see a very distinct impact of what is going on in terms of what economists are working on the way in which policy is conducted.
It's the point at which we transition to asking our audience participants to contribute and ask questions. I'm standing up mostly so that I don't miss seeing people in this part of the auditorium because I'm too short to see over the podium. But just a couple ground rules. First, a reminder that just as these officials have been, this is an on-the-record, web-streamed, recorded session. So when you stand up or recognized, if you can't stand up, when you're recognized, please identify yourself and any affiliation you deem appropriate. Second, I am going to take questions one at a time because, as with the slot machines in the new Sun Casino, if you get lucky, you might get 4 answers instead of just one. So you'll pull the arm and see what spins up. Who would like to first pose a question to our panel? There, please.
Thanks. Adam, at the very start of this
I'm
conference...
sorry, your name and affiliation,
Excuse me.
please.
I'm David Folks, I'm at the SARB, and I've kind of half lost my voice, which is why this is the first question I'm asking. Okay, so right at the start of this conference, you sort of exploded a bomb under everyone by saying, you know, amongst other controversial things, maybe inflation expectations don't really work anything like the way we think they do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions over this key part of our monetary policy paradigm. That seems like a big problem. And we sort of listened to that and kind of nodded our heads and then kind of gleefully went on with the rest of the program talking about how communication's great, we should do more of it, it's very important. But maybe that's all wrong. You know, maybe no matter how much we communicate, how much we use reggae and Twitter videos and so on, we're just not going to reach the large majority of people. Maybe the paradigm's just not working anymore. If that's true, you know, all this other stuff that we've been discussing really doesn't seem that useful anymore. So my question is, what are the risks that we really just have this paradigm wrong, and in 10 years we're going to think we're pretty silly about it?
Well, so my comments were off the record. But just to say, welcome to my life, setting off an intellectual bomb and then everything proceeds as though nothing ever happened. My colleagues here may wish to comment. I would just say the following. I think what I've said about inflation targeting going way back, including some work I wrote about the Bundesbank and the Swiss National Bank in the late 90s, is that I think you have to view inflation targeting as about communication in the sense of a broader move to transparency and consistency, and as I increasingly became convinced over the years, as a measure of legitimizing the powers of the central bank. And part of that, which I think was reflected very much in the practicing officials' remarks, was it's not you're talking to people because you're going to get them to get in their head they should monitor this particular inflation index and the target is 2.4. That obviously is available in the printed materials on the website and the discussions, but the reason you engage, as both the governor and the deputy governor mentioned, is to have this sense of people's ownership with and engagement with the bank, and that, as was a recurring theme, some awareness of what monetary policy, what the central bank can and can't do, both in the sense of literally what they can control and not, and in the sense of what is their remit or not, that it doesn't involve business licensing permits or making sure the exchange rate is never moving. So I think if you, without trying to dodge, I think actually consistent with some of the ideas I've put forward, but more importantly across the remarks of our distinguished panel, is that communication need not be seen in the narrow sense of issuing inflation reports and documenting forecasts and so forth. It's about the process of engaging with the responsible public. Luis, you indicated you wanted to speak.
Maybe to be a little bit more on the optimistic side. I think the common sense that we can reach is that using exclusively one specific tool in policy making is not necessarily the winning game. I think there are some merits and successes in the flexible inflation targeting framework that was used in many EMEs and which have proven a tool not only to reduce inflation but also to anchor expectations even after slightly higher level than advanced economies. But I think we also realize that these instruments need to be complemented by other types of policies, whether it is coordinating with, for example, fiscal policies when there is room for maneuver, or of course when there is also the way in which you can coordinate this with productivity enhancing structural reforms. So I think the common sense that emerges from many discussions with policymakers is the need for a balanced approach when the activation of some specific tools, instruments, and frameworks need, of course, at some point in time, be complemented with others, whether it is the coordination of other macro policies at the country level, but also structural reforms. And of course, some degree of international dialogue and cooperation. Think of, for example, trade policies today, so that you can enhance and increase not only local social welfare, but global social welfare.
A 1 on that in terms of number of replies, but you got mine, so you can round up to 2. I will try to remain silent. Another question from the audience, please. Over here.
Thanks, Chris Lowell from the Reserve Bank. So I guess my question boils down to this. How big is the risk that macroprudential policymaking becomes more analogous to the efforts to price control in the 40s and 50s, or more like inflation targeting with simple rules that are understood by people and can be communicated effectively? Thanks.
So in the 60s and 70s, or even earlier, credit controls were quite common around the world, and that was viewed as a complementary tool to, say, interest rates or monetary targets. Today's macroprudential policy is very different in spirit. So the best way to think about macroprudential policy is within the setting of stress tests. So what regulators around the world are doing is to say, what would happen to capital in the banking system or to the wealth of households if you assume that a very adverse shock hit? And that could be an adverse global shock or an adverse domestic shock. And then you ask, would there be enough capital, say, in the banks relative to this adverse shock? And so in that way, capital adequacy is determined. And then sometimes on top of that, there are buffers that are activated. And so those buffers are sort of like additional insurance against any exuberant financial cycle or so that is evolving. So this is really not about controlling the amount of credit. It's really about taking out enough insurance so that financial institutions or households or corporates are well capitalized relative to bad shocks.
Just as another example of where I threw a bomb and everyone ignored it, both at Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and at Bank of Canada, I gave speeches calling for a rules-based macroprudential as opposed to discretion. And the reason I bring that up is I think that's one way of taking your broader point, that we're used to talking in the monetary policy space about where are you in the spectrum between a hard rule and discretionary policy, and inflation targeting, as I think most of us perceive it, is as a somewhere in between, but towards the more disciplined side. And just for what it's worth, I take your question very seriously. I think there's a lot of room for trouble in macroprudential policy if it's not rules-based, or in other words, the trade-off on flexibility and discretion versus rules and macro-proof strikes me as a much worse one than in monetary policy. But that is a position that doesn't seem to be coming up very much. We have a gentleman over there.
Thank you, Chair. One thing that hasn't been... sorry, Jean-François Mercier from the Reserve Bank. A topic that has not really been discussed that much over the last day and a half is this topic of quantitative easing, the fact that many central banks are still adding or trying to, considering, if not, considering reverting to more quantitative easing. And there has been a debate as to how much that potentially distorts prices, affects the pricing of risk, the behavior of fund managers. You know, the Global Financial Stability Report talked about that in one of its chapters. But at the same time, we're talking about like macroprudentials to limit sort of spillovers shouldn't there be also a reflection about whether these quantitative easing tools have, or unconventional monetary policy tools have outlived perhaps their role? Because otherwise we feel that by promoting a combination of macroprudential and monetary policy, we are building a dam, but at the same time adding water in the dam lake, you know? So how does the panel see the future of this sort of coordination?
Can I encourage particularly the governor and the deputy governor to say something, if they're willing, about sort of apropos of what Luis and the Brazilian Central Bank said a few years ago. How do you view the continuation of quantitative easing among the rich countries in terms of how it affects your countries?
Yes, I said that Luis's minister characterized it as a currency war at the time. And the way in which we had thought about it, we had to think about the impact of quantitative easing on the South African economy. And it came as, what we had seen was a surge in capital flows, and the surge in capital flows led to an appreciation of the currency. It didn't lead to a surge in credit, but it did lead South Africa to behave as if it is richer than what it is. And so it meant that we could delay the difficult decisions that we were supposed to make because there was cheap money that was available. And we ran a current account deficit and a budget deficit, and so we could easily fund this. And the way in which we had to think about what would the end of quantitative easing mean, we had to then start to think that it would be the reversal, which means there will be a capital outflows, it would be a depreciation of the currency, and that the depreciation of the currency, though, could fit itself into domestic price formation and lead to a rising inflation. And if it leads to rising inflation, then we would need to react from a policy perspective on that basis. The Fed threw a taper tantrum, and we saw gyrations in our markets. But since then, the Fed actually communicated so well that we think that the withdrawal of quantitative easing was smoother. So in our narrative, we were preparing for the normalization of policy. And the Fed began to normalize policy. They were increasing interest rates. Now, the point now is that it's no longer that we are concerned that quantitative easing is being withdrawn, is that it might return. And it returns in a different environment to the one that we had seen, and if this time around is driven in the main from the ECB, because earlier on it was the Fed that was the first mover. And JF, yeah, it's not quite correct that quantitative easing was not mentioned in the past 2 days. Monique mentioned it, but she is a diplomat. And so she just put it in the form of a quotation. And I must say that, I mean, I said this before, that, you know, when South Africans talk about quantitative easing, it's not an instrument that we would have to employ at this stage. We have got quite a space. Interest rates are still positive in both nominal and in real terms, and the monetary transmission mechanism is functioning, so we do not have to worry about it. Well, looks like the South African version of quantitative easing sounds more like modern monetary theory rather than quantitative easing as we know it.
I want to really affirm a lot of what the governor said. I think Kenya stands very much in the same position. We thought something was ending and then it didn't end. Now we're not sure where it's going. But for us, we wouldn't have to employ these unconventional tools. I think what I am seeing, which is quite interesting, is I'm seeing renewed interest in Kenya as a market for investment, and I presume it's chasing yields, given the liquidity that exists in other parts. So I think that's where we would keep our eye and watch and see what the trends are there. Thank you.
So there are certainly unintended consequences of quantitative easing, which is that vulnerabilities are building around the world, and we would advise for countries to deploy prudential tools to contain the buildup of vulnerabilities. In our view, monetary policy's primary objectives are macroeconomic, and prudential tools should be used to address those unintended benefits.
One of the things that is not said about the effects of quantitative easing is the distributional effects. And I struggle to see how I think about these distributional effects. Because you see, the owners of financial assets are not particularly poor. And so when you say you are embarking on quantitative easing, you are going to buy these financial assets from people who are not particularly poor, and you might actually be boosting the prices of these financial assets, and then we complain that the rich have gotten richer, and we forget that it is through government effort that we made them richer by buying these financial assets from the rich. And in a way, it sucks the central bank into this debate about distributional issues. Yes, monetary policy does have distributional effects, but quantitative easing becomes even more pronounced in terms of distributional effects.
Just a word on it. It's been just 2 reports published at the BIS assessing precisely QE and unconventional monetary policy. I encourage those who are interested in looking at it. The message that I think we all realize that these exceptional tools manage to, at that particular moment, save the world from another great recession was an important achievement of these new tools. I think the debate that is taking place is precisely how long can you continue using these exceptional tools. They belong now to the toolkit of central banks, but certainly that's probably also in the debates in press and among academics is whether now, at some point in time, they should also be complemented when there is a space by the coordination with other macro policies, including, for example, fiscal policies.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our time. We've run 2 minutes over, but I think you'll agree it was well worth the extra 2 minutes. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for such a frank and informative exchange that builds on the knowledge that this conference generated, but also the knowledge drawn from their extensive experience. Thank you very much. You wish to close, I assume.
I'm having an easier task, which is to do what central banks do, which is to take the punch bowl as the party gets hotter, and have to tell you that the conference is coming to an end. But once again, I'd like to thank Adam and for making the trip and for facilitating this panel, but also for giving us an opportunity earlier in the year in April, where I had to deliver a lecture at the Peterson Institute. I was very nervous about that lecture, but I am glad that it eventually worked. But I'd also like to thank all the presenters and the authors of the papers and their research assistants for making this conference a success. I've got to advertise to say I expect to see you here in 2021. We are celebrating our centenary in 2021. We are starting to commission papers for the conference. We will be hosting a research conference jointly with the Bank for International Settlement. And since it will be the 100th, we promise you it will be even better than the one that we have here. But once again, for the authors to say that you might have realized in the last session that there were lots of questions from the Reserve Bank staff because they are looking for answers. Because when we go back to the office and I ask them these questions, they are most likely going to say, but you had all these academics, why didn't you ask them when they were here? But just to say also that we used the conference to provide us with a mirror. Central banks, we spend a lot of time talking to ourselves, and when we feel under attack, we retreat to Basel and we talk to each other about how you deal with the attack in your country, how did you deal with that attack in your country, and we console each other. And we forget that there is a bigger world out there. And so bringing the academics is that the academics do not have boundaries. Their job is to continue to search for truth. And so they ask difficult questions that makes central bankers a little bit uncomfortable. But I can tell you this central bank does not get uncomfortable when you ask difficult questions. We always welcome that. We are trying to build a culture of very robust debates here. It is something that you might actually be seeing in our monetary policy pronouncements. We have many times had divided committees because people have got strong views on many subjects, and it just so happened that the previous 2 committee meetings happened to be unanimous, and then it was, oh, groupthink. But I checked that in the past 18 meetings, these were like the first 2 consecutive meetings where we had unanimity. We do value debates, and bringing in people who are not within the central bank, and also more importantly, coming from elsewhere in the world and bringing other perspectives is what will make us strong. Because as the SARB, what we believe that our strength lies in the power of our argument. And it is when people can't stand the power of our argument that they throw insults at us. And we see through those insults because we believe that we have the correct argument, and we continuously test this argument with our peers and so forth. And over the past 2 days, as you have seen, it had been subjected to robust conversations from people who had come from elsewhere in the world. I think from this conference, I think that the big takeaway is that we still have a lot of work with respect to communication. My communication team, I'm sure they would leave from here and says that, well, we still none the wiser. I know a lot had been said that central bankers are not good communicators. I think that we are still better communicators than the other economists. I noticed that many of the academics can't speak English, and so when they realize that they can't speak English, they switch to Greek. And so most of the things they put on the board, they've got lots of Greek alphabets, and that becomes a challenge. But as we close, I would like to thank the staff of the bank, what I would generally call the conference staff, for putting these things together. But I think that I would like to mention amongst them the chief hustler, which Sandra Adendorf. She doesn't take a no for an answer when we request speakers, and we write a letter and we say, please come and speak at our conference. And Sandra will keep on sending you emails reminding you that you have not responded to the governor's letter asking you to come and speak at the conference. And she has been putting these conferences together. I don't know how many of these she has put, at least 5 now. So thank you very much, Sandra. Sandra is the hustler. Hanley Hobson is the facilitator. She made sure that things are arranged here. So if you liked the food and you liked the water and all these arrangements, that's where Hanley was was coming through. But once again, thank you very much. See you in 2021.